slide.
I've shared. Wonderful. Okay. There we go. All right. Today, I'm going to examine clues as information objects in 4 short-form Christie texts. I'll delve into what is information and what is a clue, then walk through a couple of examples. It turns out this is not easy, so let's start gently. By clue as information object, I mean items that can be used to change the understanding of the person who perceives them in a specific context. So let's explore that a little bit. First, we should define clues and information. This is a wildly shortened definition of information that really requires a long discussion from Claude Shannon, the father of mathematical information theory in 1948, to Gregory Bateson, who took a cybernetics approach that you see there by the person inscribing directly into the other person's brain, all the way through modern scholars like Michael Buckland, an information scientist who developed the most influential typology of information that we've got in our field up to this time, and Luciano Floridi, a philosopher of information at Oxford University, whose diagram you see there as well. But pretty pictures aside, I'm going to take a short definition of information today that includes 5 key aspects, which include information carries meaning by way of a message. The meaning of the information can be changed through alterations in that message. Meaning to a recipient should cause a change in understanding. Meaning can be intrinsic to the information object, but the recipient's change in understanding will be shaped by their own context, and an information object can be acted on in many ways. So that's information. Now, what is a clue? A clue needs to be noticed by detective and reader, and noticing doesn't only mean seeing. Clues use additional senses. We are accustomed to visual clues, like the presence of a weapon, the placement of an accessory such as a handkerchief, footprints in a flower bed, or a tiny object on the floor. But there are other sensory channels for clues. Kinetic clues rely on motion, such as someone stooping to retrieve something or stiffening upon the opening of a closet door. There are olfactory clues, such as the odors of cigarette smoke and of oranges, and audio clues, such as an overheard conversation or the toll of a gong. The use of senses beyond sight to perceive clues is intrinsic to the definition of clue and its distinction from related concepts like evidence. Evidence shares, of course, an etymological root with witness, visual, etc., and even in everyday use is shaped by definition of what counts as legal evidence. But clue comes from gathering, like a ball of yarn, and unraveling of that yarn as a symbol in the myth of Theseus and the labyrinth. A clue can be anything. Its definition as a clue emerges through its being acted on, gathered, and its own actions, guiding. But direct, detailed treatment of clues in research is surprisingly limited. This lack of focus is especially odd given P.D. James's statement that the clue is the factor that changes a story into a mystery story. From the earliest rules for detective fiction from Knox and Van Dyne, clues have been both vital elements of the detective story and somewhat ill-defined, the thing to be stated, described, gathered, analyzed, lighted on, or produced, and with the active role to point or lead. As pointers, clues can be signs, but when clues' semiotic role is framed as a series of wrong interpretations only to finally be read into the one singular correct interpretation, they lose semiotic resilience. Umberto Eco helps a bit here, reinforcing a need for semiotic complexity, saying, clues are seldom coded, and their interpretation is frequently a matter of complex inference rather than sign function recognition. An example from Christie's Dead Man's Mirror clarifies this neatly. A burst bag smelling of oranges remains equally a sign of there being a bag that once contained oranges. The bag does not lose that facet of its informativeness while simultaneously signifying a homely device that can be used to mimic the sound of a gunshot. So the clues in the 4 texts here, among all those other things, are information objects, flexible items whose layers of meaning and signification can be used to change understanding. To be able to act on an information object requires enumerating its attributes. Organization systems, from my field, typically capture attributes of the same kind about every information object. Every book in a library has a title, every artifact in a museum has an acquisition date. But we interact with information objects according to the attributes salient to our context instead of the same attributes for every object, and fictional detectives do the same. In the market basing mystery, Poirot and Hastings discuss a handkerchief. Poirot identifies its salient attribute, its location in Prothero's right coat sleeve. Hastings struggles to identify the attribute that is important in this context, though. He thinks of decoration, plain, fabric, cambric, color, white, and cleanliness, no mark or stain, drawing no conclusions. It's Hastings. Later, Poirot draws attention to the salient attribute of location up his sleeve, which Hastings interprets according to his own knowledge that sailors carry their handkerchiefs in their sleeves. Only at the end does Poirot stress to Hastings the correct interpretation in context. The location in the right sleeve indicates that the dead man was left-handed. Similarly, with the green quill pen in Murder in the Mews. In normal life, typical attributes of pens include style, ink color, cost, and ease of writing, but in Bardsley Garden Mews, salient information attributes of a pen include location left or right of the blotter and indications of use. Innocent of ink versus ink stained. I have used the word object in the sense thus far of material thing, but the word object also has the sense of having action directed to it. Shifting between objects as indicators and objects acted upon is not unique. A similar back and forth is demonstrated in Van Dyne's 20 Rules, where clues are things to be stated and described, gathered and analyzed, but are also capable of pointing at the culprit. Knox's 10 Commandments only invoke clues once, but treat clues as objects acted upon in 3 distinct ways within 19 words. Detectives can light on them, the writer must produce them, and the reader may inspect them. The codification of the form of detective fiction explicitly called for clues to simultaneously signify and be manipulated. And rarely do we find in Christie clues that are static signs and only interacted with once. Clues demonstrate a spectrum from inscribed and intentional information content, a letter, a label, a will, to information coming from the materiality of the object itself, a footprint, a spent match. Many clues offer inscribed and material content simultaneously. The color of ink used to write a letter may be as informative as its content, or the letters on a label from a vial of medicine may be as informative as the amount of dust on the label. So I thus determined that as information objects, clues have 4 interesting aspects. They are mutable, they are malleable, they offer information, misinformation, and disinformation, and they act as boundary objects, anchors of shared meanings across contexts. My explanation is anchored in very specific, tiny examples rather than occupying a big conceptual space. And we can all think through similar examples and counterexamples to extrapolate abstractions of each concept. My specific examples help us avoid broad generalizations and overly simple categories. However, the Christie corpus is so large and heterogeneous, as is all of Golden Age crime fiction, that one can find a counterexample against pretty much anything. I've also excluded important extremes. I omit the quintessential Christie crime method of poison, a very significant crime method of stabbing, central to Murder on the Orient Express and the murder of Roger Ackroyd, among others, and more esoteric methods like horn to the head from the roof or strangling by ukulele string, etc. Instead, I've looked at arguably the most prosaic approach to death, a gunshot wound to the head, and used that unremarkableness and homogeneity. But see, Death on the Nile refutes even that idea across 4 works to draw out concepts that do reflect difference. You notice I didn't provide a picture for this one. These texts comprise 2 pairs. Short story, The Second Gong from 1932, expanded and revised into the novella Dead Man's Mirror in 1937, and short story, The Market Basing Mystery from 1923, which shares a plot device and outline with the novella Murder in the Mews from 1936. All 4 feature Poirot and a death by gunshot. The pairings demonstrate how the same clues can be used differently and how different clues can be used to the same purpose. In Dead Man's Mirror and The Second Gong, the same clues of the position of the body with respect to the French window, desk, and mirror, the shivering of the mirror, and an extra toll of the gong in the hall incriminate different killers with different roles in the household and different motives. The Market Basing Mystery and Murder in the Mews show different sets of objects serving identical informative purposes. That served parsimoniously by a handkerchief in the former is served extravagantly by an expensive watch on a moire strap and a flamboyant emerald green quill pen unused in the latter. Some clues are the same across the pairings and serve the same purpose. In Dead Man's Mirror and the Second Gong, a key locational temporal clue from which room in the house someone emerges at a specific moment is the consistent fact pointing to the culprit. In The Market-Basing Mystery and Murder in the Mews, a large number of smoked cigarette stubs in the room with the body offers similar information for Poirot. So clues as information objects are mutable. A clue as an information object, like most information objects, is not stable. It changes through typical use. Mutability is the changes in information that are not intentional with respect to the crime, but provide clues to solving the mystery anyway. Take the paper bag in Dead Man's Mirror. When Poirot and we first notice that paper bag, it's in the waste paper basket in the drawing room, crumpled and smelling of oranges. The bag did not originally smell of oranges, but acquired this olfactory information through its use by the Carpenter and Sons fruiterers. It was not originally crumpled, but became so by way of an as yet unknown action, and it did not from the beginning carry the location information wastebasket, but was placed there by a human who acted as one typically would with a crumpled paper fruit bag. Another example of mutability is the ashtrays of smoked cigarette stubs in The Market-Basing Mystery and Murder in the Mews. Cigarettes turn into stubs through normal use. It doesn't require anything unusual. Yet a smoked cigarette stub, or 20, collected in an ashtray or fireplace grate is a substantively different clue from 20 unsmoked cigarettes. This specific mutability, not an intentional piece of misdirection, is key to the information gleaned from this clue. Clues as information objects are malleable, changeable through intention of being changed rather than incidentally through use. Take the broken cufflink in The Market-Basing Mystery. Its information is changed multiple times as it is broken, picked up by the housekeeper, dropped near a dead body, seen near the body, pounced on by Inspector Japp, showed to the housekeeper who denies recognizing it, identified by another woman as belonging to her husband, and shown to the husband who denies owning it at all. Each of these willful actions causes a change in the information afforded by this single small clue. Another malleability is the location of the bullets in The Second Gong and Dead Man's Mirror. In both, the bullet is found below the mirror, where it should have fallen after passing through the head of the dead man. In both, Poirot has seen someone stoop to pick up something from the floor. It was the murderer retrieving the bullet from where it landed in the hall outside the study, not under the mirror. In both cases, the murderer has, unseen, placed it below the mirror, intentionally changing its information value. The Second Gong's bullet is also so malleable that for the time, it turns into a matchbox and then a tiny fabric rosebud. Not really. But the item that Poirot saw someone retrieve, otherwise undefined, is first explained as being a matchbox, with the goal that Poirot will be convinced it really was a fabric rosebud. In Dead Man's Mirror, the bullet is also so malleable that for a while it turns into a pencil. While the bullet itself does not change, the object picked up by the person in the hall is explained away as being a bullet-shaped pencil. Clues offer information, truth, misinformation, through error in presentation or interpretation, and disinformation from deliberate falsehood. Most clues as information objects are used as disinformation and information. Misinformation is rare within published stories. True errors are edited out, and too many intentional errors may, in the hands of a writer less deft than Christie, a murder is announced, detract from the narrative. For Christie, misinformation is generally found in the impressions of Hastings, if it happens at all. If anyone erroneously interprets a clue, it is likely he. In the stories here, Hastings only appears once, and his erroneous interpretation, the location of Prothero's handkerchief, is not wrong at all. It is a glimpse of Prothero's true identity, an additional interpretation, semiotic resilience, that is simultaneously true and yet not the primary interpretation that leads to the solution of the crime. One example of information per se offered by a clue is the extra sound of the gong in The Second Gong and Dead Man's Mirror. In each case, the guest whose bedroom is nearest overhead to the gong outside the study races downstairs upon hearing the second gong for fear of being late to dinner and never invited to the house again. The phantom first gong is only heard by this house guest and is dismissed by the rest of the house party as being an explicable misapprehension by a guest anxious to make a good impression. Poirot uses the phantom gong as the true information it is and uses it to solve the mystery. An example of disinformation is the dressing case in Murder in the Mews. Jane Plenderleath uses the case in the closet as disinformation for the detectives, needed because she knows they have noticed her tense reaction, kinetic clue, and the true informational clue in this space to their search of the closet. Japp and Poirot refuse to be disinformed by the dressing case, stressing its unrelation to the crime based on its contents, but Plenderleath foregrounds it insistently, stressing the disinformation by sneaking off to throw the case, which she's already emptied out, into a lake. Poirot's refusal to engage with this disinformation, his recognition of the simultaneous kinetic clue, and his connection of the other items in the closet to clues in Barbara's sitting room allow him to solve the mystery. Finally, clues serve as boundary objects. I was glad that we already talked about liminal space today because that connects up to boundary objects, because boundary objects are used by multiple people for their own needs simultaneously with variable levels and types of shared meaning. Boundary objects are both adaptable to different viewpoints and robust enough to maintain identity across them. Spoilers here. One example is the position of the gunshot wound on the body and the body in the room in all 4 stories. The information offered to each observer by these positions is different, although the gunshot wound and the body, at least after the detectives have entered, do not change. To Inspector Japp, a gunshot wound in the head, apparently self-inflicted, signifies that the deceased had difficulty with debt or a woman. To Dr. Giles, the wound is a sign of impossibility. As police surgeon, he cannot resolve the locked room with the gun in the right hand and wound entering on the left side of the head. For Constable Pollard, this conundrum is a cause for action. Remembering Japp is in market basing, Pollard is impelled to find Japp and seek his help. For Japp, the position of the wound is a thing to observe firsthand rather than taking the word of others. For Poirot, it is a thing to ignore. In examining the corpse, he focuses on the handkerchief in the coat sleeve instead. For Miss Clegg, the position of the wound is an opportunity for retribution, and the gunshot wound in Murder in the Mews is a similar boundary object for the parallel players in that story. Another boundary object is the French window in Dead Man's Mirror, the second gong. Even outside the context of a detective story, a French window is a boundary object of 2 kinds anyway: a see-through boundary between 2 locations and a boundary object between 2 types of object, a window and a door. In these stories, the French windows continue their boundary object role. For the domestic staff, the French window is something over which a curtain must be drawn. For the police, it is locked and thus confirms the death absolutely as a suicide. For Poirot in Dead Man's Mirror, it is an opportunity to distinguish himself as having had a pleasant chat with a burglar, which affords him a context inaccessible to everybody else in which to read the French window's information as a clue. He sees it can be locked from the outside without a key. In the second gong, he again uniquely sees the French window as a door that can be locked from the outside without a key. Clues are obliged to do a lot of work for the writer, the story, and the reader. They inform, they misinform, they disinform. They are subject to many intentional and incidental changes, and at their best, they simultaneously inform and baffle multiple participants, diegetic and extra-diegetic, within and outside the story. Without a clue, there is no mystery, and clues as themselves deserve a little more analytic attention than in general they've been given. Thank you.